I've watched you, admired your strength. You deserve the world.
I'm mad as you is.
You are worth every risk.
Thank you. I feel it.
They put a man who had never once lost a negotiation across a dinner table from a woman they assumed he would dismiss. And by the end of that evening, the most feared businessman in Seoul was the one asking if they could meet again. What happened between appetizers and dessert broke three men's assumptions, silenced an entire restaurant, and left a woman who never cried reaching for her napkin. This is that story. The reservation was made under a fake name. This was Park Hyun-soo's first mistake, not the fake name itself, but the fact that he genuinely believed a fake name was the most deceptive thing about his plan. It was not. The most deceptive thing about his plan was the plan itself. The quiet confidence with which three grown men, each of whom had watched Kang Min-jae dismantle careers and reroute entire supply chains with the energy of someone sorting mail, had decided that tonight would be funny. History is full of men who mistook proximity to danger for immunity from it. Hyun-soo was simply the latest entry. He had reserved a corner table at Yunha, which was the kind of restaurant where the menu had no prices because the clientele had no reason to ask. 40 floors above Seoul, behind floor-to-ceiling glass that turned the city into a glittering circuit board. It was the sort of place where careers were celebrated and occasionally, quietly ended. Hyun-soo had chosen it carefully. He needed the setting to feel significant. He needed Min-jae to have nowhere obvious to leave. He had made the booking 3 weeks ago. He had also, in those 3 weeks, told exactly 2 other people, Ryu Sung-woo and Baek Jun-ho, Min-jae's other closest friends, and had sworn both of them to secrecy with the solemn gravity of a man who did not fully appreciate that he was describing the plot of a prank to people who were absolutely going to be there to watch it unfold. All 3 of them would arrive early. All 3 of them would sit behind a very large potted plant, approximately 6 meters from the reserved table. None of them had thought carefully enough about what Min-jae would do when he eventually spotted them, because none of them had yet been forced to confront the fact that they were not the protagonists of this story. Kang Min-jae arrived at 7:45. He was always early. This was not courtesy. It was control, the instinct of a man who had long since decided that walking into any room after someone else was a form of information surrender. You learned more about a space when you arrived first. You learned where the exits were. You learned who watched the door. You learned, in short, whether the room was somewhere you should be. He wore a charcoal suit with no tie, which on most men would read as casual, and on him read as a deliberate choice to look like he hadn't tried, which was itself a form of trying that took more effort than most men's formal wear. His watch was expensive and understated. His shoes were the kind that didn't make a sound on marble floors, which several people in his past had found deeply inconvenient. The maitre d' recognized him immediately. This happened everywhere Min-jae went, and it had nothing to do with fame. It was something in the architecture of how he moved, unhurried but directional, like a current that wasn't rushing but also wasn't going to change course. He was shown to the table. He sat. He ordered mineral water. He looked at the menu for approximately 45 seconds, closed it, and then looked at the city below. Seoul in the rain was something he had never grown tired of, which surprised him sometimes. He had grown tired of most things. The negotiations that once felt like chess now felt like arithmetic. The victories that once felt like vindication now felt like maintenance. He had built over 20 years exactly the life he had aimed for, and discovered, in the manner of a man reaching the top of a very long staircase, that the view was fine, but his knees hurt. He had not told anyone this. He was not the kind of man who told people things like this. He was instead the kind of man who sat in restaurants alone and looked at the rain and waited to see what would happen next, with the patience of someone who had survived enough surprises to stop fearing them. He noticed the potted plant at 6 meters. He noticed, behind it, the unmistakable silhouette of Park Hyun-soo's terrible posture. He said nothing. He picked up his water. He decided he would allow this to play out, not because he was curious about the outcome, but because watching Hyun-soo believe he was invisible for the next hour seemed like reasonable compensation for whatever was about to happen. At 8 o'clock exactly, Maya Johnson walked through the door. She was wearing red, a deliberate, saturated, unapologetic red that did not ask the room's permission. She walked the way she always walked into rooms where she suspected she was being watched. Shoulders back, pace even, chin at an angle that communicated, "I see you seeing me, and I have already decided how I feel about it." She had developed this walk over 39 years of entering spaces that had formed opinions about her before she opened her mouth, and it had never once failed her. The restaurant noticed her. It always did. In Seoul, she stood out. A tall, Black American woman moving through a room that was almost entirely Korean. Her presence large in a way that had nothing to do with her size and everything to do with the simple fact that she had decided to be entirely herself in a space that had not anticipated her. Some rooms shrank people. Maya had long since stopped allowing rooms to do that. She scanned the space, found the table, found the man sitting at it. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Not blankness, not appraisal, not the particular careful neutrality of a man composing his face for her benefit. He was simply looking, the way you look at something you find genuinely interesting and don't yet have a category for. She reached the table. He stood up. This was the first thing that surprised her, not because standing was extraordinary, but because he moved without hesitation, without the half-second of adjustment she was used to seeing in men recalibrating their expectations in real time. He simply stood, pulled out her chair, and said in accented but precise English, "You're earlier than I expected." She sat, looked at him, said, "You're calmer than I expected." Something shifted almost imperceptibly at the corner of his mouth, and behind the potted plant 6 meters away, Park Hyun-soo turned to Ryu Sung-woo and whispered, "This is not what I planned," in the voice of a man beginning to understand that he had set something in motion that he no longer had any power over. He was right. He just didn't know yet how right he was. The menu at Yunha was written in 3 languages: Korean, English, and the quiet universal dialect of numbers so large they stopped being numbers and became statements. Maya scanned it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had eaten in expensive restaurants on 4 continents and had long ago stopped being impressed by them. What she was doing, more precisely, was buying time. She was good at reading rooms. She was, in fact, professionally excellent at it. Her entire distribution model was built on the ability to walk into a market, assess the temperature in under 60 seconds, and position herself accordingly before anyone realized she was positioning. It was, her business partner back in Atlanta had once said, like watching someone play chess while everyone else thought they were playing checkers. The man across from her was not playing checkers. She could feel it immediately, the way you feel when you're talking to someone who isn't performing interest but actually has it. Most men, when they looked at Maya Johnson, completed a rapid internal calculation that she had watched happen thousands of times. The sizing up, the resorting, the quiet renegotiation of expectations. It flickered through their eyes like a screen loading. Kang Min-jae's eyes were doing nothing of the sort. He was watching her the way you watch a city from a height, with attention, not judgment. It was, frankly, disorienting. She set the menu down. "You ordered already?" "Water," he said. "I find it easier to eat after I know who I'm eating with." She studied him. "And do you know who you're eating with?" "Not yet," he said, "but I'm paying attention." It was an answer that should have sounded like a line and somehow didn't. Behind the fern, the surveillance operation was deteriorating. Baek Junho's leg had fallen asleep approximately 20 minutes ago, and he was now attempting to shift his weight without producing any noise, which was proving impossible because Yuna's floors were polished to the specific hardness that broadcast every footfall like a small announcement. Ryu Sung-woo had made the poor decision of ordering appetizers from their hiding position, which had required a very uncomfortable whispered negotiation with a server who had clearly seen this kind of thing before and had chosen professionalism over commentary. Hyun-soo, for his part, was watching Min-jae with the growing unease of a man who had lit a fuse without fully thinking through what was on the other end. "He hasn't even checked his phone," Junho whispered. "Min-jae never checks his phone at dinner," Sung-woo said. "He checks his phone constantly, not at dinners that matter." They both looked at each other. "He thinks this matters?" Junho said. "Apparently," Hyun-soo said, with the specific quietness of a man revising several assumptions simultaneously. The appetizers arrived. Hemulpajeon, sliced thin and precise, with a dipping sauce that smelled like the sea. Maya hadn't ordered it. It had simply appeared, the way things appeared in restaurants where the kitchen decided what you needed and delivered it with authority. In Atlanta, she would have raised an eyebrow. In Seoul, she had learned in 4 days that this was simply how meals worked here. The kitchen was not asking. The kitchen was informing. She took a bite, closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. "Good?" Min-jae asked. "Better than good," she said. "My first night here I ordered room service and cried a little. The food is that good. That's not something I admit easily." He almost smiled. "Not quite, but almost. What brought you to Seoul? The conference or something else?" "The conference," she said. "And 2 deals I've been building for 8 months. She paused. You? I live here. I meant, what brought you to this restaurant tonight? The almost smile became slightly more definite. Apparently, my friends believe they are funnier than they are. Maya had not yet looked at the potted plant. She looked at it now, looked back at him. The three men behind the fern, she said. Yes. How long have you known? Since I sat down. She absorbed this. And you didn't leave. He considered this for a moment with the seriousness of a man who gave actual thought to questions that other people answered reflexively. I thought about it, he said. Then you walked in. It was the most direct compliment she had received in years, and it arrived so plainly, without architecture or agenda, that it took her a moment to accept it as what it actually was. They talked about business first because they were both people who understood that business was never just business. It was biography, compressed and formalized and made presentable for conference rooms. She told him about her company, a distribution network connecting Black-owned American food brands with international markets. 7 years built from a single idea and a terrifying amount of stubbornness. 12 employees now, 4 continents. And the Seoul Summit as the next move on a board she had been playing for the better part of a decade. He listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been. When she finished, he said, the resistance you encountered, domestically, was it capital access or distribution gatekeeping? She blinked. Both, but the gatekeeping was more expensive. It always is, he said. Capital has a price. Gatekeeping has a philosophy. Philosophies are harder to negotiate with. It was the kind of sentence that belonged in a lecture hall or a boardroom, except he hadn't delivered it that way. He'd said it the way people speak when they've learned something firsthand, through cost rather than curriculum. Maya filed this away. You've experienced gatekeeping, she said. I am what happens, he said, when gatekeeping underestimates someone long enough. Across the restaurant, a woman at an adjacent table leaned toward her companion and said something in Korean, low, quick, accompanied by a glance in Maya's direction, and a smile that was doing its best impression of being private. It was not private. Min-jae heard it. Maya watched his face change, not into anger, which she expected, but into something colder and far more deliberate. The stillness of a man who has decided something and is simply waiting for the correct moment to act on it. He turned to the adjacent table, and he spoke. 3 sentences, quiet as a closed door. Maya caught none of the Korean. She caught everything else, the way the woman's smile dissolved mid-face, the way her companion suddenly developed a profound interest in his soup, the way the surrounding tables all pretended very hard not to have heard anything while clearly having heard everything. Min-jae turned back, picked up his chopsticks. Shall we order the main course, he said, as if he had done nothing more consequential than adjust his napkin. Maya looked at him for a long moment. What did you say to her? She asked. He met her eyes. I reminded her, he said simply, that this city is smaller than she thinks, and that her husband's import licensing renewal is handled by someone who has lunch with me on Thursdays. A beat of silence. That's terrifying, Maya said. Yes, he agreed without apology. She picked up her own chopsticks. Thank you, she said quietly. He didn't say you're welcome. He didn't say it was nothing. He said, with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone stating a position they have held for a long time, no one speaks that way at a table I'm sitting at. And for the first time that evening, Maya Johnson felt something she hadn't expected to feel tonight, in this city, at this table, across from this man. Safe. The main course arrived the way all important things arrived at Yunha. Quietly, deliberately, and with the confidence of something that did not need to announce itself to be significant. Galbijim braised short ribs, slow-cooked until the meat had stopped arguing with the bone, and simply surrendered, arranged beside a bowl of steamed rice so perfect it looked architectural. Maya stared at it for a moment with the expression of someone who had been briefly ambushed by beauty in an unexpected place. She had eaten well her entire life. Her grandmother in Birmingham had cooked with the specific authority of a woman who understood that feeding people was not a domestic act, but a political one. A daily declaration that the people at her table deserved abundance, deserved care, deserved the best of what the kitchen could offer, regardless of what the world outside thought of them. Maya had inherited this understanding the way she inherited everything from that woman, completely, permanently, and with no ability to separate it from her own identity. Good food, to Maya, was never just food. It was a position. She took the first bite and said nothing for 3 full seconds, which Min-jae watched with the focused attention of a man who had learned to read silences more carefully than sentences. Your grandmother cooked, he said. It was not a question. She looked up. How did you know that? The way you closed your eyes, he said. People who grew up with real food remember it in their bodies. People who discovered good food as adults appreciate it in their heads. Those are two different expressions. Maya set her chopsticks down and looked at him with the particular assessment of someone recalibrating a calculation. You notice a lot, she said. It's a survival skill, he said without drama. In my industry, missing what a person's face is doing has consequences. What industry is that exactly? She said. The invitation said businessman. Seoul is full of businessmen. He considered her for a moment. Financial infrastructure, he said. Asset management, strategic acquisition, a pause. And the occasional situation that doesn't have a clean category. The occasional situation, she repeated. Everyone in my position has them, he said. The honest ones admit it. The dishonest ones get caught eventually. Maya decided to file this response in the folder she mentally labeled Revisit Later and moved forward. Behind the fern, Baek Jun-ho had finally accepted that his leg was not going to wake up on any schedule that respected his dignity, and had shifted into a position that could generously be described as reclining and accurately described as lying sideways against a planter while pretending to check his phone. Ryu Sung-woo had eaten all of the appetizers and was now quietly negotiating a second round. Park Hyun-soo had not moved in 20 minutes because Park Hyun-soo was watching Min Jae's face with the intense concentration of a man trying to reverse engineer a situation he no longer understood. Min Jae was laughing. Not loudly, not the performed room-filling laugh of men who wanted audiences. It was small and genuine, the kind of laugh that happened because something was actually funny rather than because laughter was expected. Hyun-soo had known Min Jae for 26 years and could count on one hand the number of times he had seen that particular expression. He's laughing, Hyun-soo whispered. I can see that, Sung-woo said. Min Jae doesn't laugh at dinner. He does, apparently. What is she saying? I can't hear from here. Move closer. Absolutely not, Junho said from his position on the floor. I value my life. What Maya was saying at that precise moment was this. She was describing the first international deal she had ever tried to close, a distribution agreement with a European grocery chain that had, over the course of 8 months of negotiations, managed to simultaneously express enthusiasm for her product line, deep admiration for her business model, and a bureaucratic creativity in finding reasons to delay signing that bordered on artistic. Every week, a new requirement. Every week, a new form. Every week, a new stakeholder who needed to be consulted, who was unfortunately traveling, who would be available next month, who had now unfortunately been restructured out of the relevant decision-making process. By month 7, she said, I had provided them with 43 documents, flown to Brussels twice, and sat through a 3-hour meeting in which a man who had clearly not read any of my materials asked me to explain, and I quote, whether my supply chain was resilient enough for the European context. What did you say? Min Jae asked. I said, my supply chain survived a global pandemic, 2 shipping crises, and a partner who embezzled $40,000 and then had the nerve to send me a LinkedIn connection request from his next job. Define resilient. Min Jae laughed. There it was, the small, genuine, unperformed laugh that Park Hyun-soo was observing from behind the fern, with the disoriented reverence of a naturalist witnessing a species previously believed extinct. Did they sign? Min Jae asked. They signed, Maya said. Month 8. After I stopped following up and they realized I had started talking to their direct competitor. Leverage, he said, with the appreciative tone of someone hearing their own language spoken by an unexpected source. Always, she said. I learned early that patience without a deadline is just waiting. Patience with a deadline is a negotiation. Min Jae looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize, the one that appeared when she said something he hadn't anticipated, and he was taking a moment to actually process it rather than simply respond. Who taught you that? He asked. Experience, she said. And my grandmother. Who would have called it something less polite but meant the same thing? The rain had intensified outside. Seoul below them was blurred and luminous, the streets reflecting light in long liquid streaks that made the city look like a painting that hadn't quite dried. Maya had grown up in Atlanta, where rain came in summer with the dramatic conviction of a season making a point. Seoul rain was different, quieter, more persistent, less performance, and more fact. She found herself looking at it between sentences, the way you look at something beautiful when you're in the middle of something else. And you don't want to stop what you're doing, but you also don't want to miss the view. Min Jae followed her gaze to the window. It rains like this most of the year, he said. People who don't live here think of Seoul as a summer city. They're wrong. It's a rain city. It's built for it. Do you like it? He considered this. I grew up in it, he said. There's a difference between liking something and being made of it. Maya turned from the window and looked at him. There was something she had been circling for the last hour, a question that sat underneath all the business talk and the food and the polished surface of two competent people doing what competent people did in new situations, which was to lead with their credentials and work backward toward anything more real. She had a sense, increasingly, that Min-jae was also circling it, that underneath the precision and the quiet authority and the 3 sentences that had silenced the adjacent table, there was something that matched something in her, some specific, particular exhaustion she recognized from the inside. She wasn't ready to name it yet, but she was getting closer. The plates were cleared. A server arrived with a small printed card, the dessert selection presented without prices, because at Yunha the assumption was always that you would stay and you would order, and the number at the end was simply a formality between people who had already committed to the evening. Maya looked at the card, looked at the man across from her, made a decision. Can I ask you something that's not about business? She said. Min-jae set down his tea. You can ask me anything, he said. I'll tell you if it's something I don't answer. She appreciated that. Most people said of course and then dodged. He was offering a perimeter rather than a performance. Do you get tired, she said carefully, of people deciding who you are before you speak? The question landed in the space between them and stayed there. Min-jae looked at her for a long moment. Not with surprise exactly, but with the recognition of someone who has heard, for the first time in a while, a question that required a real answer. Outside, the rain continued its patient work on the city below. Inside, somewhere behind a potted plant, 3 men held their breath. The question sat between them like a third person at the table. Min-jae did not answer immediately, which Maya had come to understand, in the space of 2 hours, was not evasion. It was the opposite. He answered slowly because he was answering honestly, and honesty, real honesty, the kind that costs something, required a moment to locate before it could be delivered. She waited. She was good at waiting. 39 years of being underestimated had taught her that silence was not a vacuum to be filled, but a pressure to be applied. Most people, given enough quiet, would eventually say the true thing simply to end the discomfort. Maya had learned to be comfortable in the quiet long before most people reached that point. Min-jae, she noticed, was also comfortable in it. They sat in the silence together for a moment, 2 people who had each learned the same lesson from opposite directions, and the silence itself was more communicative than most conversations Maya had sat through in the last decade. Then he spoke. Since I was 22, he said, since before I had anything worth deciding about. She hadn't expected the specificity. Most men asked a question about vulnerability, answered in generalities, vague acknowledgments shaped to sound like honesty without actually being it. Min-jae had given her a number, 22, which meant there was a story behind it, and he had just quietly indicated he knew exactly where it started. 22, she said, not a question, an invitation. He turned his tea glass slowly on the table. A small, considered movement. I grew up in a neighborhood in eastern Seoul that no longer exists in the way it existed then, he said. It was the kind of place that shaped you whether you wanted it to or not. My father worked in a factory. My mother cleaned offices. I was the first person in my family to attend university, which everyone celebrated, and which meant, in practice, that I arrived at university without money, without connections, and without the particular fluency that people from certain backgrounds carry in their bodies like a second language. Maya nodded. She knew this fluency, the absence of it, the specific tax it levied. There was a professor, Min-jae continued, first semester, finance. He reviewed my application essay in front of the class, not maliciously or not consciously maliciously, which is sometimes worse. He said I had an interesting perspective, that the essay showed raw potential, that with the right guidance, someone from my background could develop the foundations necessary for real success. He paused. He meant it as a compliment. It wasn't, Maya said. It was a ceiling dressed as encouragement, he said. I have spent 26 years building past it. Behind the fern, the atmosphere had changed. Park Hyun-soo had stopped watching with the anticipatory energy of a man waiting for a punchline and was now watching with the uncertain expression of someone who had ordered something from a menu and received something categorically different, not worse necessarily, but so unlike what he expected that he was still in the process of understanding what he was looking at. Ryu Sung-woo had put his phone away. Baek Junho had, at some point in the last 20 minutes, managed to restore circulation to his leg and was now sitting upright, elbows on knees, watching the table with the focused attention of a man at a film he hadn't expected to care about and now couldn't look away from. "This is not what I planned," Hyun-soo said again, for the second time that evening. In the quieter and more genuinely reflective way he said things when he was being honest rather than strategic. "No," Sung-woo agreed. "He's talking about his father." "I know. Min-jae doesn't talk about his father." "I know." A long pause. "I think," Junho said slowly, "that we may have accidentally done something good." Hyun-soo considered this with the discomfort of a man not accustomed to his jokes landing somewhere meaningful. "Don't make it weird," he said. Maya had been listening with the particular quality of attention she reserved for moments when someone was telling her something real. Not the polite, nodding attention of professional settings, the full kind, where you stopped composing your response and simply received what was being given. She recognized the architecture of Min-jae's experience, the way you recognize the layout of a building you've never been inside, but whose blueprint you've studied for years. The details were different. The structure was identical. "The interesting thing," she said when he finished, "is that they always frame it as help." "Always," he said. "The professor who tells you that you're promising for someone like you. The investor who says your concept is compelling but maybe not ready for this market. The journalist who writes about your success and spends 4 paragraphs on your background before they get to the business." She looked at him steadily. "They always think they're opening a door. They never notice that opening a door for someone implies that the door was closed, implies they have the key, implies the whole architecture of the building is theirs to manage." Min-jae was quiet for a moment. "I have never heard it described that way," he said. "I've had 39 years to find the words," she said. The dessert had arrived without either of them ordering it. The kitchen had simply decided, as the kitchen at Yunha always decided, and delivered a bingsu so delicately constructed, it looked less like food and more like an argument for the existence of patience. Shaved ice the consistency of snow, layered with condensed milk and small precise arrangements of strawberry and red bean, finished with a dusting of something that caught the restaurant's light and made the whole thing glow faintly. Maya looked at it. "I didn't order this," she said. "No one orders it," the server said, with the serene confidence of a man delivering scripture. "It is selected for you." He left. Maya looked at Min-jae. "Does that happen everywhere in Seoul, or just here?" "Just here," he said. "And in my mother's kitchen, but for different reasons." She smiled. Genuinely, unguardedly, the full version of a smile she didn't always deploy in unfamiliar spaces because an unguarded smile was information, and information was leverage, and she had learned early to manage what she gave rooms access to. She gave this room access to it. Min-jae watched it happen and did not look away. This was the part of the evening where things shifted, not dramatically, not with any signal that a casual observer would have clocked as significant. But Maya felt it, the specific change in atmospheric pressure that happened when a conversation stopped being an exchange of credentials and became something else. Something with less protection and more territory. She had not planned to have this kind of conversation tonight. She had planned, in fact, to eat well, make a competent impression, leave politely, and send a brief thank you message to the contact who had arranged this, phrased carefully enough to convey appreciation without encouraging a follow-up. She had planned to be present, but boundaried, engaged, but armored. She had not planned on Kang Min-jae. She had not planned on a man who listened like it was a skill he had deliberately developed, who answered questions with a number and a story instead of a deflection, who had silenced a room on her behalf without making it about himself, who ate dinner the way she ate dinner, with attention, without performance, as if the meal deserved respect and the conversation deserved more. She had not planned on any of this, and so she said the thing she hadn't planned to say. "I want to tell you something," she began, "and I'm going to ask you to just let me finish before you respond, because I don't say this to many people, and I need to say it in one piece or I'll edit it into something more manageable and lose what I actually meant." He set down his spoon. He looked at her. "Take all the time you need," he said. And in the careful, unhurried quiet of that sentence, no rush, no performance, no subtle pressure to arrive faster at whatever she was going to say, Maya felt something she had not expected to feel in this city, at this table, across from this man. She felt heard before she'd even spoken. Which was, she would think later, exactly when she knew. She told him, not everything, not yet. But the core of it, the specific weight of walking into every room already judged, already categorized, already assigned a narrative that had nothing to do with who she actually was, the exhaustion of it. The way it never fully went away, no matter how many deals she closed, or stages she stood on, or articles were written about her with 4 paragraphs about her background before they got to the business. She said it plainly, without performance. The way people speak when they have decided the person across from them is worth the truth and the risk that comes with it. When she finished, the table was very quiet. Min-jae looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Every room I walk into, people have already decided who I am. The difference between us is that they're afraid of me, and they're dismissive of you. I'd rather be dismissed. Fear is lonelier." It arrived without warning, without decoration, without any of the machinery that people usually constructed around sentences they wanted to land well. It simply landed. Maya blinked. And then, because she was not a woman who cried easily, because she had trained herself over decades to keep her eyes dry in rooms that would use her tears against her, because she had built an entire professional identity on the foundation of composure under pressure, tears filled her eyes anyway, not from sadness. From the specific, rare, disorienting relief of being understood by someone who had no reason to try. Now, before we go further, because this story isn't just about one evening, ask yourself something. Have you ever walked into a room and felt the verdict before anyone opened their mouth? Have you ever been the Maya at that table, competent, accomplished, fully present, and still somehow invisible until someone chose to actually see you? If you have, this story is for you. And if you believe, genuinely believe, that every person at every table deserves the dignity Min-jae extended without being asked, hit that subscribe button right now. Like this video. Drop a comment below and tell me, whose words have made you cry? Not from pain, but from finally being seen. Because the people who won't subscribe, they're the ones who walked past Maya in every room she ever entered. The napkin sat folded on the table between them. Maya had used it once, quickly, with the efficient precision of a woman who had decided that tears were permitted, but spectacle was not. She had not apologized for them, she had not explained them. She had simply looked at Min-jae after a moment, steadied herself the way a building steadies after a small tremor, not damaged, just recalibrated, and said, "That was an extraordinarily honest thing to say." "It was a true thing," he said. "I find honesty and truth overlap more than people expect. Most people say true things wrapped in enough insulation that the truth never actually reaches anyone." "I know," he said. "I spent 20 years doing that. It's exhausting." She looked at him with the frank assessment she usually reserved for balance sheets and partnership agreements, the look that stripped presentation and examined structure. "What changed?" she asked. He considered this. "I stopped being afraid that people would use the truth against me," he said. "And then I realized the people worth talking to never would have." Maya picked up her tea. "That," she said, "is either wisdom or something you tell yourself after surviving enough damage to make peace with it." "Both," he said. "Usually both." The restaurant had thinned. The adjacent table, the one that had briefly hosted Seoul's least self-aware socialite and her liquid studying companion, had been cleared and reset, pristine and empty, with no evidence that any exchange had occurred there beyond the efficient neutrality of Yoonha's staff, who had clearly witnessed enough interesting evenings to have developed a professional policy of amnesia. 2 other tables remained occupied at the far end of the room, a couple celebrating something, anniversary or deal, the distinction barely mattered at Yoonha, and a solitary man in a gray suit working through documents with the focused misery of someone who had confused a restaurant with an office and was too committed to leave. Maya noticed all of this in the peripheral way she noticed most things, not consciously, but constantly. The background processing of a woman who had learned that environments held information if you stayed alert to them. What she was consciously focused on was the man across from her. Specifically, she was focused on the thing he had said, "Fear is lonelier," and the way it had continued to resonate in her chest long after it had been spoken, the way certain sentences did when they named something you had known but never articulated. She had a file in her mind, built over 39 years, of things people had said to her that she carried forward. Her grandmother, 2 professors who had actually meant it, a business partner who had looked at her first terrible prototype and said, without irony, "This is the beginning of something." She was filing Min-jae's sentence in that same drawer. This surprised her. She did not add to that drawer easily. "Can I ask you something now?" he said. "You can ask," she said. "Same rules apply." The corner of his mouth moved. "The red dress," he said. "Deliberate?" She raised an eyebrow. "Everything I wear is deliberate." "I thought so," he said. "What does red mean?" She looked at him steadily. It means I decided to be here, fully, without apology. She paused. Some rooms don't deserve that. I wear red to the ones that might. And this room? He asked. She held his gaze for a moment. Still deciding, she said. It was not coy. It was accurate. She was genuinely still in the process of deciding, still moving through the calculation of who this man was versus who he presented himself to be, whether the gap between the two was manageable or significant, whether the evening was a pleasant anomaly or the opening chapter of something that deserved a next page. Min Jae received this answer without visible disappointment. Fair, he said. And then, because he was apparently a man who understood that genuine interest did not require the other person to have arrived at certainty on any particular schedule. Take your time. She told him about Atlanta. Not the Atlanta of conference brochures and economic development reports. The real one. The neighborhood she had grown up in, where her grandmother's house had been the fixed point around which everything else orbited, where summer smelled like cut grass and exhaust and the specific sweetness of whatever was on the stove, always something on the stove. Her grandmother operating the kitchen with the legislative authority of a woman who understood that abundance was a form of resistance. She told him about the business, not the polished origin story she delivered to investors and journalists, where she had learned to edit her struggles into a narrative that was inspiring without being threatening, relatable without being pitiable. The real version. The version where she had maxed out 2 credit cards, lost her first major client to a competitor who had undercut her price by 30%, and matched her quality by 0%, spent 4 months unable to make payroll, and had sat in her car outside her own office on a Tuesday morning in November, asking herself whether she was genuinely building something or simply refusing, out of stubbornness to accept that it wasn't working. What did you decide? Min Jae asked. That stubbornness and vision look identical from the inside, she said. And the only way to find out which one you have is to keep going long enough to see the outcome. You kept going. I kept going. He looked at her with an expression she was now able to read with more accuracy. Not quite admiration, because admiration had a quality of distance in it, a separation between the person feeling it and the thing being admired. This was closer than that. This was recognition. I know that Tuesday morning, he said. Not yours, mine, but I know it. Everyone who built something real has that Tuesday, she said. And everyone who didn't, he said, has an opinion about why you shouldn't have kept going. Maya laughed. Genuinely, the full version, the one that arrived before she could decide whether to release it. It was at this point that the evening took a turn that neither of them had planned for. A man approached the table. He was perhaps 55, expensively suited, carrying the specific confidence of someone who had never once been told that his confidence was misplaced. He addressed Min Jae in Korean, briefly, with a nod toward Maya that managed to be both acknowledging and dismissive in the same motion, the social equivalent of noting that a chair was in the room without considering that the chair might have opinions. Min Jae responded in Korean. Crisp, short. The man said something further. His tone shifted slightly, still conversational, but with a subtext that Maya couldn't decode in language but could absolutely read in register. Min Jae's expression did not change. He said one sentence. The man's confidence recalibrated visibly. He nodded once to Min Jae only and moved away toward the exit with the particular gait of a man pretending that the conversation had gone exactly as he intended. Maya watched him leave. Business? She asked. Someone who wanted me to know he'd seen me here tonight, Min Jae said. And who I was with. Maya processed this. Is that a problem? Min Jae looked at her with calm directness. Not for me, he said. I stopped managing other people's observations about my choices approximately 15 years ago. It simplified things considerably. And for me, she said, not with concern, with clarity. She was a guest in this city, in this world, at this table. She wanted to understand the landscape she was sitting in. Nothing about tonight will reach anyone who matters without going through me first, he said. Simply. Factually. The way he apparently said most things that were actually quite significant. Maya absorbed this. There was something almost preposterous about it, the matter-of-fact assurance of a man who could make that sentence true and knew it. In her world, information moved laterally, horizontally, through networks she could influence but not control. In his world, apparently, information had a more structured relationship with authority. She wasn't sure how she felt about this. She was sure, however, that he had offered it as protection rather than performance. The difference mattered. I want to ask you something else, she said. Ask. The loneliness you mentioned, she said carefully. The fear being lonelier than dismissal, is that current? It was the most direct question she had asked all evening. Min-jae looked at her for a long moment. Outside the window, Seoul continued its rain-blurred luminosity, patient and vast, a city of 12 million people, moving through wet streets below a restaurant where two people were having, without having planned for it, the most honest conversation either of them had managed in years. Yes, he said, one word. No scaffolding, no qualification, no careful construction of a sentence designed to convey vulnerability while maintaining deniability. Just yes. Maya looked at him. She thought about the red dress, about deciding to be somewhere fully without apology, about the rooms that didn't deserve it and the rooms that might. She picked up her tea. Tell me, she said, about what you wanted to build, not the empire. Before the empire, what did you actually want? And Min-jae, who had not answered that question honestly for anyone, possibly including himself, in longer than he could precisely calculate, looked out at the rain for a moment, looked back at her, and began. He had wanted, at 22, to build something that lasted. Not in the abstract, motivational poster sense of the word, not legacy or impact or any of the other large, weightless words that ambitious people deployed to make their hunger sound philosophical. He had meant it in the most literal, material sense available to a young man from Eastern Seoul who had watched everything around him disappear. The neighborhood of his childhood had been demolished when he was 19, not gradually, not through the slow attrition of neglect, but deliberately. Cleared by a development company to make room for apartment complexes that would be sold to people who had never lived there and would never think about what had stood before. His father's factory closed the same year. His mother's office building was renovated, and the cleaning contracts were reassigned to a larger firm that paid less and asked fewer questions. Everything his family had built their life around, not wealth, nothing as grand as wealth, simply the specific texture of a life in a specific place, had been replaced by something shinier and more profitable and completely indifferent to what it had displaced. Min-jae had watched this happen with the focused attention of a 20-year-old who was translating grief into information in real time, filing every detail of how power moved, how decisions were made, who benefited, and who was simply absorbed into the cost column of someone else's spreadsheet. He had thought, I will understand this system well enough that it cannot do this to me. He had not thought at 22 about what understanding the system would cost. He told Maya all of this without performance, without the editorial distance that usually appeared when he discussed his origins in professional settings. The careful framing that transformed hardship into asset, struggle into credential, the strategic deployment of vulnerability in quantities precisely calibrated not to actually make you vulnerable. He told her the unedited version. And Maya listened with the quality of attention she had offered him all evening, complete, still, without the small fidgets and redirections of a person composing their response while you were still speaking. She listened as if what he was saying was the only thing in the room, which, for him, was extraordinary. He was not accustomed to being the only thing in a room. He was accustomed to being the most powerful thing in a room, which was categorically different and in its own particular way, far lonelier. The system works, he said finally. That's the thing people don't want to acknowledge. The people who benefit from it say it works because it rewards merit. The people it damages say it's broken. Both are wrong. It works exactly as designed. It was designed to work for specific people in specific ways, and it does, with remarkable efficiency and absolutely no malice, which is the worst part. Maya nodded slowly. Malice would be easier, she said. Infinitely, he agreed. Malice has a face. Malice has an address. You can negotiate with malice or defeat it, or at minimum identify it clearly enough to route around it. Indifference just continues. Regardless, it doesn't need to hate you to erase you. That's what happened to your neighborhood, she said. That's what happens everywhere, he said. To neighborhoods, to businesses, to people. The machinery doesn't notice. That's not a flaw in the design. That's the design. Maya was quiet for a moment. Then, so you built a counter machine. He looked at her. That's what you did, she said. You didn't just climb the system. You learned it well enough to build something that ran parallel to it. That could apply the same pressure in different directions. She paused. The occasional situations without clean categories. Min-jae studied her face. You're not frightened by that, he said. It was an observation, not a question. Should I be? Most people are. Most people, Maya said, setting down her tea with the quiet finality of someone making a point, haven't spent 39 years watching perfectly legal, perfectly respectable, perfectly documented systems erase perfectly good people without a single villain they could point to. She met his eyes. At least your method leaves fingerprints. The silence that followed was the kind that arrived not after a conversation had run out of things to say, but after it had arrived somewhere neither participant had fully anticipated, and both needed a moment to look around and determine where they were. Min Jae looked at her for a long time. I have spoken to journalists, lawyers, government officials, and 3 separate prosecutors, he said carefully, and none of them have ever described my work with that particular clarity. None of them were trying to understand you, Maya said. They were trying to categorize you. And you? I'm trying to understand you, she said. There's a difference. Behind what had formerly been the Fern position, the 3 men had relocated, sometime in the last hour, to a table in the far corner after the maitre d' had approached with the serene diplomatic authority of someone exercising maximum tact in a situation that did not deserve it and suggested, very gently, that perhaps they might be more comfortable with a proper table and a proper menu. Hyun-soo, Sung-woo, and Jun-ho sat in a configuration that could best be described as chastened. They had ordered food they were not tasting. They were watching a conversation they could not hear from this distance, which was in some ways worse than hearing it, because the visible texture of it, the way both people leaned slightly forward, the way the silences looked inhabited rather than empty, the way Min Jae's hands moved occasionally in a gesture none of them had seen from him in professional settings, told them everything they needed to know about what was happening at that table. He's going to call us, Jun-ho said. Not tonight, Sung-woo said. Tomorrow. Tomorrow, Sung-woo agreed. What do we say? Jun-ho asked. Hyun-soo, who had been quiet for the better part of an hour, picked up his chopsticks, put them back down, and said, We say we're sorry for the prank, and we're not sorry for the outcome. He'll know the difference, Sung-woo said. Good, Hyun-soo said. He should. Maya had been in Seoul for 4 days. She had 2 days remaining before her return flight to Atlanta, a tight itinerary she had constructed with the precision of someone who understood that time in transit was time not working and had scheduled accordingly. Day 5 was the final summit session and the closing dinner for conference delegates. Day 6 was the second distribution meeting, the one she considered the more important of the two, with a Korean logistics firm whose regional director had been carefully non-committal in emails, but whose body language in their first meeting had told her what his words hadn't, which was that he was very close to yes and simply needed one more reason. She had been planning to spend her remaining evenings preparing. She had not been planning any of this. She found, sitting across from Min Jae with the rain continuing its patient work on the city below, that she was not particularly troubled by the deviation from plan. This was unusual. She was, by temperament and by necessity, a woman who lived in her plans, who understood that improvisation was a luxury available to people with safety nets, and that her particular position required the kind of preparation that left no gaps for the unexpected. And yet, the unexpected had pulled out her chair, ordered mineral water, silenced a room on her behalf, and spent the last 3 hours being the most honest person she had sat across from in longer than she wanted to calculate. I have 2 days left in Seoul, she said. Min Jae looked at her. I know, he said. You mentioned the conference schedule. I did, she said. I have the closing dinner tomorrow and a logistics meeting the following morning. The logistics firm on Tehran Row, he said. Kim Sung-rok's team? Maya stared at him. How do you know that? Seoul, he said simply, in the tone of a man for whom the city was less a place than an extension of his own operational awareness, is smaller than it looks from the air. Do you know him? We've worked together, Min Jae said carefully. He's thorough. He takes longer than necessary to make decisions he's already made because he believes the deliberation period demonstrates seriousness. A pause. He's already made this one. Maya absorbed this. You're not going to intercede. I wouldn't, he said with immediate and genuine certainty. Your deal closes on its own terms or it doesn't close. That's not my meeting. She had needed to hear that. She hadn't known she'd needed to hear it until she heard it. The clear delineation of where his world ended and hers began, offered without being asked, which was the only way it would have meant anything. After the logistics meeting, she said, my flight is at 8 in the evening. He was quiet. I would like, she said with the deliberate, unhurried precision of a woman who had decided something and was delivering the decision rather than the deliberation, to see Seoul properly before I leave. Not the conference version, the real one. Min Jae looked at her. Outside, the rain had begun, almost imperceptibly, to ease, the city below clarifying incrementally, the lights sharpening from impressionist blur into something more defined, more present, more itself. "I know a place," he said, "where the city looks the way it actually is rather than the way it presents itself." "That's exactly what I want," she said. 6 o'clock, he said. "The morning of your flight. I'll drive." It was not a grand romantic declaration. It was a logistical proposal delivered with the same precision he applied to everything, which was, Maya had decided, its own kind of romance. The romance of a man who took your time seriously enough to plan around it rather than simply hoping you'd make space for him. 6 o'clock, she said. And across the restaurant, at a corner table where 3 men were pretending to eat food they could not taste, Park Hyun-soo watched Min-jae smile, fully, completely, without the careful architecture of a man managing his expressions, for the first time in longer than any of them could remember. He picked up his chopsticks, he ate, he said nothing, because some things did not need commentary, some things simply needed to be witnessed. The bill arrived. Min-jae settled it before Maya had processed the arrival of the small leather folder, which she noted and chose not to contest, not because she could. Thursday arrived the way important days always arrived, looking exactly like an ordinary one. The alarm on Maya's phone sounded at 5:15. She was already awake. She had been awake since 4:30, which she would not have admitted to anyone, and which she attributed internally to jet lag and the logistical pressure of a travel day, rather than to anything more specific, more personal, or more accurately located in the fact that she had spent 2 days since that dinner moving through conference sessions and distribution meetings with perfect professional focus, while some quieter part of her kept returning, without permission, to a table 40 floors, above a rainy city and a sentence about fear being lonelier than dismissal. The logistics meeting had gone exactly as Min-jae had indicated it would. Kim Sung-rak had arrived deliberate and non-committal, had spent 45 minutes asking questions whose answers he clearly already possessed, and had then, with the air of a man arriving at a conclusion through independent reasoning rather than prior certainty, extended his hand across the table and said that he believed they had the foundation for a productive relationship. Maya had shaken his hand with the composed satisfaction of someone who had known this was coming and had prepared for it anyway, because preparation was not about the unknown, it was about deserving the outcome when it arrived. She had texted her business partner in Atlanta immediately afterward. Seoul deal closed, both of them. The response had come back in under a minute. "I'm making a reservation somewhere nice for when you land. You're buying." She had laughed in the elevator. At 5:58, a black car appeared at the entrance of her hotel. Min-jae was driving himself, which she had not expected. She had half anticipated a driver, the full apparatus of a man who moved through Seoul with operational infrastructure. Instead, it was him, alone, in a dark car with the engine quiet and the heater already running, which she noticed because the morning air was sharp and the warmth that met her when she opened the door was not accidental. He had thought about the temperature. She filed this. "Both deals closed," she said, settling into the passenger seat. He glanced at her. "Kim Sung-rak?" "Yesterday afternoon." "Good," he said, with genuine satisfaction. Not pride in having predicted it, satisfaction on her behalf, which was different and which she recognized as different. He'll be a reliable partner. He's slow to commit and fast to deliver. That combination is rarer than it should be. "I noticed," she said. He pulled out into the empty early morning streets of Seoul. The city at 6 in the morning was a different city entirely. Maya had seen Seoul at conference pace, between sessions and meetings, and the organized momentum of a schedule that moved her from hotel to venue to restaurant without much space to simply look. She had seen it at night from 40 floors up, beautiful and abstracted, reduced by distance into light and geometry. She had not seen it like this. At 6 in the morning, Seoul belonged to different people. The market workers moving through Noryangjin with the focused efficiency of people who had been awake for hours already. The elderly residents doing Tai Chi in the small parks between apartment blocks. The street vendors arranging their first offerings of the day with the unhurried deliberateness of craftspeople who understood that presentation was preparation and preparation was respect. The city was in the process of becoming itself again after the night, like a person in the first hour of the morning before they had assembled their public self, honest, quiet, provisional. Min-jae drove without narrating. He did not point at things and explain them. He did not perform the city for her benefit. He simply drove through it and let her see it, which was the right choice and which she noticed. They stopped first at a small market near Gwangjang, where the stalls were just opening and the air smelled of sesame and green onion and something frying that Maya couldn't immediately identify, but which her entire body responded to with the unanimous verdict of yes, immediately. He bought 2 paper cups of something from a woman who appeared to be approximately 90 years old, and who addressed Min-jae with the unimpressed familiarity of someone who had known him long enough to have outgrown being intimidated by him, which Maya found enormously charming. "She calls you by your first name," Maya said, accepting her cup. "She knew me when I was nobody," Min-jae said. "She refuses to update her assessment. Smart woman, the smartest," he said without irony. "She also makes the best bindaedok in Seoul, which is a separate but related achievement." The cup contained a broth that tasted like the foundational memory of warmth, deep and clean and specific in the way that only things made by one person in one place over decades could be specific. Maya drank it standing beside a market stall in the early morning light of a city she was leaving in 12 hours and thought, not for the first time and with increasing acceptance, that this trip had not gone as planned in any way that mattered and had gone exactly right in every way that did. They drove to Naxon Park as the sun was completing its intention to rise. The city spread below the old fortress walls in every direction, not the selective panorama of a restaurant view, curated for elegance, but the full version, the real topography of Seoul in all its density and contradiction, apartment blocks beside ancient gates, beside glass towers, beside small temples. 12 million lives arranged in the particular organized chaos of a city that had been destroyed and rebuilt. So many times it had developed a philosophical relationship with impermanence. They stood at the wall. The light was doing what early morning light did to cities, making them look briefly like themselves rather than like the version they presented to the daytime world. "This is what you meant," Maya said, "the city as it actually is." "Yes," he said. He was standing beside her, not close enough to be presumptuous, close enough to be present. "Most people see Seoul from inside it. You have to get above it to understand the shape." "I feel that way about most things," she said. "So do I," he said. They stood in the light for a while, not speaking, in the particular comfortable silence of 2 people who had already said enough true things to each other that silence was no longer a gap, but a continuation. Then Maya said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask." "The night of the dinner," she said. "When you decided not to leave. When you saw your friends behind the plant and decided to stay anyway." She looked at him. "What did you think was going to happen?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the city. "Nothing," he said. "I thought it was going to be a moderately uncomfortable evening engineered by people who love me in the blunt, inconsiderate way that people love you when they've known you long enough to believe they have jurisdiction over your happiness." A pause. "I thought I would stay for an hour, be polite, and leave. I did not think," he stopped. "You didn't think what?" she said. He looked at her. In the early light, with the city behind him and the walls of something 400 years old framing the space he occupied, he looked, for the first time since she'd met him, like a man who was not managing anything. "I did not think," he said, "that I would spend the next 3 hours speaking to someone and feel, at the end of it, less like myself had been depleted by the conversation and more like it had been returned to me. Some part of it I had stopped expecting to find." Maya looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved through the park. Below them, Seoul was beginning its daily negotiation with itself. Traffic accumulating, voices rising, the vast organized machinery of a city's morning assembling into its familiar shape. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "I don't do this," she said. I'm not someone who meets a person at a dinner she didn't plan to attend and stands on a wall in a foreign city at 6 in the morning, feeling like the trip became something different than the trip she came for." She paused. "I'm careful. I'm structured. I plan." "I know," he said. "So do I." "And yet," she said. "And yet," he agreed. She looked at the city, then at him, then made a decision with the clean, committed finality of someone who had examined a situation thoroughly enough to know that continued examination was simply delay dressed as diligence. "I come back to Seoul in March," she said. "The second distribution agreement has a review clause. I'll be here for a week." Min-jae looked at her. "March," he said. "I'm telling you in advance," she said, "because I'm not interested in whatever the version of this is where we exchange numbers at an airport and gradually become polite strangers who mean to stay in touch." She held his gaze. "I'm telling you in advance because I wanted to see what you did with the information." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll clear the week. Not I'll try. Not let me check my schedule. Not the careful, qualified language of a man maintaining optionality." 4 words, delivered with the complete absence of hesitation, which was its own kind of declaration from a man who she had learned applied hesitation exactly as long as a situation warranted and no longer. Maya nodded. Good, she said. They had breakfast at a small restaurant near Dong, a place with 6 tables and a menu written on a chalkboard and food that arrived without ceremony and tasted like someone had taken the concept of a meal seriously as a form of love. They ate slowly. They talked about small things, her grandmother's kitchen versus his mother's kitchen, the specific regional differences in Korean barbecue that Min Jae described with the passionate precision of a man who had clearly conducted research and had opinions he was not embarrassed by. The question of whether Atlanta's summer heat or Seoul's summer humidity was more objectively unreasonable, a debate they reached no conclusion on and which Maya suspected would require future installments to resolve. She noted privately that she was looking forward to the future installments. At 7:45, they arrived at Incheon. The departures hall was doing what departures halls always did, organizing the particular mixture of arrival and grief that all airports managed, the simultaneous coming and going of people mid-story, the space between one chapter and the next